How cool is it that I get to be with Margaret Hoover? That's got to be the coolest thing about this all. And with all of you, thank you.
General McMaster, thank you for your service.
Oh, hey, it's a privilege.
It's an honor to be here with you, and it's an honor to be able to ask you questions about your book, which, as the New York Times said, is beautifully written. I contest that is absolutely the case. It is beautifully written and a really wonderful insight into what it was like in those tempestuous, my words, not yours, first really 13 months of the national security strategy of the Trump administration. There were 4 national security advisors under Donald Trump. First, General Flynn, who lasted 24 days, which, as you point out in your book, not in context of Flynn, was about 2 Scaramucci's.
That's right, that's right. That's the unit of measurement that we use, right? That's right. I was 41.3 Scaramucci's.
Which is 414 days you served. Your successor, John Bolton, was there for 519 days. But I noticed that it took him less than a year to write his book.
Yeah.
Folks, I interviewed him on Firing Line. Some folks that I talked to in preparation for that program told me that after some of his meetings, he would block out 45 minutes or an hour after each of the meetings. He was doing his note-taking and writing his book while he was on the job. Wow. It took you 6 years to write this book, and we are 60 days away, 58 days away from a presidential election. Right. Why the timing?
Okay, Margaret, it's just coincidental. So when I left the job as National Security Advisor, my publisher, my editors, my family, everybody wanted me to write about my time in the Trump White House, and I just thought that's not going to be very useful, like another Trump book. What I wanted to do is, kind of maybe predictably, because I stayed in uniform when I served as National Security Advisor, so I was also retiring from the Army after 34 years. And I was really concerned about the degree to which we were at each other's throats and how polarized our political discourse had become and how divided we were. So I wanted to write a book that would contribute to bringing us closer together by really highlighting the most significant challenges and opportunities we faced internationally. So that became the book Battlegrounds. And everybody kept telling me, you got to write this memoir, we'll pay you more money. And I just didn't think it was going to be useful at the time. And I thought I could write the memoir once President Trump is off the political scene. And that was kind of my intention, to really share with the American people my experience of having been National Security Advisor from the perspective really of a historian, and to fulfill what I felt was like my sense of duty as a historian.
So just to be clear, you felt that Trump would be reelected, have 2 terms. This book coming out now would be at the end of his 2nd term. Right.
Or if he was not reelected, then he would be off the political scene, which apparently he's not.
So is this book any different than you would have written otherwise?
No, it's not. It's not. I mean, I really, and I hope that the tone of the book, Margaret, or for those who have read it, is one of gratitude for service, but also just trying to give my honest take of my experience. I wanted to try to bring readers into that experience with me, show them around the West Wing of the White House, describe what it was like to serve as a National Security Advisor, and what the heck does a National Security Advisor do, and what was it like to serve as President Trump's National Security Advisor.
Yeah, well, you were a student of the National Security Council. Your thesis gave right to your first book in 1997, Dereliction of Duty, which of course you've all read. And if you haven't read it, you can watch William F. Buckley Jr.'s interview of the younger H.R. McMaster on Firing Line in 1998.
It's startling. There was hair involved.
But so one of the first things you did, and that you write about in the book, is you assembled this interagency process of creating and writing a national security strategy. Yeah. How did your historian's perspective of the council inform why you did that first?
Well, thank you for that question, Margaret. And, brace yourself for like a 45-minute answer from a historian asking about how history informed it. No, I really thought it was a tremendous gift. Okay, so having had the opportunity to study the Lyndon Johnson administration and how and why Vietnam became an American war, and I criticized from the perspective of a historian the national security decision-making process during the really crucial portion of the Johnson administration after Kennedy's assassination in November 1963 to really the July of 1965 decisions that really fully Americanized the war, with large U.S. units deploying to do a lot of the fighting themselves rather than the advisory role that had been dominant before, or the bombing campaign and so forth. And it was a surreal feeling, to walk in to the office of the National Security Advisor and then realizing, okay, Mr. Smarty Pants, as you who criticized McGeorge Bundy, now you're in charge of that decision-making process that you criticized. So I took out a legal pad on that first day, and I jotted down what I thought were the 5 most important lessons from the period during which Vietnam became an American war, so I could resolve not to make the same mistakes, at least make new mistakes, right? So the first of these was, I was struck at the time when I was writing Dereliction of Duty, that Lyndon Johnson's advisors spent very little time really considering the nature of the problems that they were facing. Yeah. And they always rushed right into action, like, what do we do about that? Well, covert operations, some bombing, deploy some troops. Well, what problem are we trying to solve? What is the nature of the challenge in South Vietnam? The second really key lesson was, hey, it's important to have a goal and an objective, right? You would think, okay, like who doesn't know that? But McGeorge Bundy actually, in this period of time, said, hey, it's better not to have an objective in Vietnam. That way, if we don't accomplish it, that will give President Johnson, quote, more flexibility in the domestic political arena. So I wanted to establish a framework for goals and objectives. The third key lesson was that a lot of the assumptions that underpinned our growing intervention in Vietnam were implicit. And because they were implicit, they were never really effectively challenged, right? That Ho Chi Minh will act like the reasonable man in English common law and respond to bombing in a certain way by reducing his support for Vietnamese communists in the South, okay? Everybody should have known that's not a valid assumption. The fourth key lesson was it's important to give the president multiple options. McGeorge Bundy and other advisors, they determined really the advice that Johnson wanted to hear. Because Johnson saw Vietnam mainly as a danger to his domestic priorities of getting elected in his own right in '64, passing the Great Society legislation in '65. And so he wanted to keep Vietnam on the back burner. And so the strategy that they gave him was called graduated pressure, which allowed him to avoid making a difficult choice between war and disengagement. And that was the only option he got. And in fact, the president's advisors, some of them said, hey, for me to keep my influence with Johnson, I have to tell him what he wants to hear, which just raises the question, okay, what the heck good is your influence anyway? Mm-hmm. And then finally, and this is related to the previous comment, is that it was important to insulate the development of those options for the president from partisan political considerations. Now, people who have partisan views and concerns, they're going to have their voice heard, but don't allow that to corrupt the development of the options. And multiple options is really an important lesson, probably the most important, because in the comparison of those different options, that you can draw out long-term costs and consequences. So
you actually give a number of examples in the book where you do this exactly with President Trump.
Right.
Say, President Trump, we have to make a decision about X, Y, or Z. Here are the 3 choices, or the 4 choices.
Right.
And then often he would pick one of those choices.
Yeah, right.
Only 2-3 days later, kind of completely change course.
Yeah.
So how easy is it to develop a strategy like the one that you devise if the principal doesn't stick with the decision? Well,
he did stick with a fair amount of them. Others he would reverse, and I think it was important to keep him in conversation about these issues, because as with any president, right, there are going to be people around a president who want to manipulate that president into certain decisions. I saw it as my job. Hey, give the president multiple options. He's the guy who got elected, right? He should have the choice. Nobody elected me. Nobody elected the Secretaries of State or Defense or anybody else. So the president should be able to determine his or her own agenda, make his or her own decisions. There's a second kind of group of people who are motivated differently in any administration, and these are people who have their own agenda. They came into the administration to get their stuff done, right? What they have in mind on trade or immigration, or you fill in the blank. And then there's a third group of people who, I think they define their role as saving the country and the world from the president. And the problem with those two latter groups, they don't serve the president well, but they also undermine the Constitution, because sovereignty lies with the people. The people elected the president. The people didn't elect any of these other people. So I saw it as my role, this is one of the chapter titles, to guard his independence of judgment, and to do so by keeping him in conversation about this. There were a lot of sort of Iago figures, who were in his ear on certain issues all the time. And so it was important.
Can I just name them for that? I mean, remember, you're being very diplomatic, but you were there at the beginning of the administration when you had Steve Bannon there, who was constantly sort of in his ear, often undermining decisions that he had made through this process that you had created. Sure. Then Bannon would go in, give him an earful or others.
Right.
And you kind of write about each of those factions,
Yes.
and you do name them, and that was quite a tumultuous time at the beginning of the administration.
The title is "At War with Ourselves" for a reason. So we were at war with ourselves inside of the West Wing, within the administration at times, but also those tensions, and what I write about in the book is they have their roots in sort of what is dividing us in our society today as well. And many of those factions were represented within, or people who were part of those factions
down the hall.
were represented down the hall.
In the West Wing.
The hall. Yeah.
So when I will tell you, when I read the book, I almost read it as like a tale of almost two contradicting stories, right? Like there's this one story that is the legacy of the Trump administration's foreign policy that they got right.
Yeah.
Right, and you spend a lot of time sort of unpacking, each area of the world and what Trump should be proud of and the Trump administration should be proud of. But then I think you also, in some cases, describe how Trump on the international stage often undermined that progress.
Yeah.
So one example is China.
Right.
Let's just talk first about what the administration got right.
Well,
about
yeah,
China.
and really the story is, thanks, Margaret. I mean, the story really is not just about all this tension and friction, but it's how we work to transcend it, how we work to really, despite that tension and friction, to create good outcomes, for our country, And I think we were largely successful, and President Trump was largely successful in those 13 months. And as you mentioned, some of those were reversed, but the China policy really stuck. And so I mentioned these kind of 5 lessons that I'd taken with me into the White House. We started to apply those based on the process that we established to help the president make the best decisions. One of those mechanisms we put into place was what we called a principal small group framing session. A lot of words there. But what that means is we would convene the Principals Committee of the National Security Council, the president's cabinet, right, secretaries of defense and state, heads of the intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies and Treasury and Commerce and bring us all together in the Situation Room to have a discussion around a 5-page paper. And I paid a lot of attention to the crafting of this 5-page paper because, again, it was aimed at addressing some of those deficiencies I had seen during Vietnam decision-making. That paper was organized with just a description of the nature of the challenge we're facing. What is the nature of the challenge with the Chinese Communist Party? The nature of the challenge, we decided, was that the Chinese Communist Party is not interested in upholding the rules of international discourse. They want to, in fact, tear them down and replace that with a new international order that is favorable to their authoritarian form of governance and is also favorable to their statist mercantilist economic model. They want to create areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region, create new spheres of influence internationally, and challenge our interests and those of our allies and partners. That was a kind of a reversal of our understanding of the China situation. We thought China, once they were welcomed into the international orders, China prospered. China would play by the rules, and it would evolve its form of governance and evolve its economic system. So the second part of the paper were the assumptions on which the planning would be based, and we flipped that assumption and said that China is not, going to support the international order. That the party is driven by a combination of fear and aspiration, fear of losing its exclusive grip on power, and an aspiration to displace U.S. power, the free world's power in the world. Then that paper had clear objectives. What did we want to achieve? And it was to prevent China from establishing these exclusionary areas of primacy, to prevent China from tearing down the international order, to maintain our competitive advantages across the free world, and to compete effectively, and to reduce our vulnerability to various forms of Chinese economic aggression, which we're seeing come to the fore now with the threat of embargoes of critical minerals and materials and so forth. And then that paper after that really just listed the assumptions I mentioned, but then the obstacles to progress and the opportunities that we could exploit. And then it ended. So right before we went to Mar-a-Lago for the first summit between Xi Jinping and President Trump, we convened this principal small group framing session. And again, like hashtag predictable for a historian, I pulled all of the previous policy papers on China from all the administrations that were post Cold War. So H.W. Bush to all the way through Presidents Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, and I read a passage from President Obama's policy paper on China that really was indicative of the other administrations too, but it was really this assumption that China was going to liberalize. And I said, and I just made the observation that we were about to help President Trump effect the biggest shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. The second part of those meetings were then our discussion about, okay, if these are our goals and objectives, if these are the obstacles to progress, if these are the opportunities, how do we integrate all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners to overcome the obstacles, to take advantage of the opportunities? Then you get in Washington what rarely happens, top-down guidance and ideas. Many of the processes in Washington are bottom-up. And as a result, you get satisficing behavior, lowest common denominators, and you get policy pablum, just meaningless papers. It has been my experience being on the receiving end of these papers in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. So I think we administered a tremendous corrective. We did that by early April. And of course, we had that summit, which I think was successful in getting that policy initiated. And that happened in the midst of strikes against Syria. So which is part of the chapter title of this, in that part of the book is a well-oiled machine, really. You know, because remember President Trump said, oh, we're like a well-oiled machine in the White House. And I think for that period of time, we really were. We were working very well together.
I mean, I think you can reflect on the sort of shift in strategic direction around China and take good credit that this has extended to the Biden administration.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
probably is, you know, we're not going back when it comes to, I think, China. But you also write about a summit with Xi that where Trump, in some ways, I mean, I'd like you to you characterize it. You say, you know, he sat down with Xi. He's in the middle of the Forbidden City. He concedes to Xi that exercises in South Korea were provocative. They were a waste of money. He suggested that China might actually have legitimate claim to Japan's Senkaku Islands. And you write a note to John Kelly that says, Xi ate our lunch.
Right, right.
So what is the consequence of the leader of the free world sitting on top of a totally new strategy vis-a-vis China, but then saying to the leader, conceding all these points that actually, and by the way, John Bolton also wrote later that he also basically said, go on with the genocide in Xinjiang province with the Uyghurs in a separate meeting. I mean, so there are sort of moments that don't represent sort of the strength of a pivot.
Yeah.
With respect to the
right.
strategy.
Although the general course of policy stayed strong there, I write in the book that I think the Chinese were so just confused by what President Trump said. I think maybe, you know, I didn't want to bring it up again, try to clarify. I thought just let this ride. But what happens with President Trump, and this is no surprise to anybody, and many of you probably know him because this is where he's from, is that he says what's on his mind. Like there is no filter, right? No filter. Now that can be good. And I write in the book that there are many times when this was very effective. Because for world leaders, it kind of rocked them back sometimes because they never hear an interlocutor, you know, who was just so, you know, so candid about what's in his mind at that moment. But he does have certain predilections that foreign leaders will try to take advantage of. And I write about these in the book, and I was really torn. I was like, should I write about this? Well, I figured, well, okay, you have Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and Erdogan and others who try to push President Trump's buttons. They already know how they try to do that.
And you write how they do it.
Right, and so maybe he can learn from that. So
whoa, hold on.
Well,
let's talk about how. Let's talk about how. But what you say, like he likes to be flattered. They know that, so they flatter him.
Right.
They
appeal to his sort of impulse toward retrenchment and the belief that others are free riding on the largesse of American taxpayers, and therefore America should stop doing what it's doing to support allies abroad. And this is great. This is what they want to play on because they want us to disengage so they can fill the vacuum, right? And this is, I'm talking about especially the two revanchist powers on the Eurasian landmass, China and Russia. So, you know, again, this is why it was important to keep him in conversation about this all the time because, you know, I could always tell when somebody had been in his ear or he was you know, forgetting maybe the rationale behind
forgetting the choices that he made that you had laid out for him.
Yes, and there were some people in the administration, and I read about this, who didn't want to talk to him about it. Like they thought, well, maybe if we bring it up, you know, he'll reverse that decision. My experience was bring it up, have another discussion, Because if you just hope that he's not going to reverse it, like he did on Syria, like he did on Afghanistan, and the relationship with Pakistan, which he just completely reversed, I think that could have possibly have been prevented by keeping him in conversation about the decision he made previously and why he decided, for example, in August of 2017, I think, to put into place the first reasoned, sustainable approach to Afghanistan we had in 16 years of war by that time. But then, of course, he reversed it, and in reversing it, he resurrected a lot of the flaws of the Obama administration's policies. And I just wondered, who was there reminding him of that? And I think sometimes people use the psychological coping mechanism of avoidance, right? And just don't want to talk about it, and I don't think that works.
So let's do. I was going to go to Russia, but since you brought up Afghanistan, I mean, I know obviously, you served in Afghanistan, you also served in Iraq, you also pioneered the counterinsurgency strategy in Tal Afar. I mean, you have been a brave leader in war in our country, and I know that the loss of Afghanistan weighs heavily on you. Talk about the Afghanistan strategy. I mean, you think
Sure.
he was in the right place and then he changed. I mean, how do you reflect on
Right.
that now?
We went through the whole process I described on Afghanistan, which was to try to challenge assumptions and to try to come up with a new approach that was grounded in the reality of the situation. I think that had been in Afghanistan, and I received there when I was commanding a task force in 2010 to 2012
Corruption.
on counter-corruption, organized crime, which a friend of mine, General Zinni, called it the anti-gravity task force. He said, "Congratulations on commanding the anti-gravity task force." But I really got to know the Afghan government, the security forces extremely well. I traveled all through the country for 2 years. General Petraeus, who I know is here often, he extended me for a second year and immediately left. I'm like, oh, thanks a lot, But I really felt like I understood what was driving the conflict in Afghanistan and how our policy and our approach was a complete mismatch with the reality on the ground. It was developed based on fantasy in Washington rather than, and so what am I talking? I'm talking about really our consistent short-term approach to a long-term problem there, which actually lengthened the war and made it more costly.
You often say it was a 21-year wars.
Right. It wasn't a 21-year. It was a 1-year war fought 21 times over. Yeah. Right. Exactly.
But you talk about the betrayal of our Afghan allies, sitting down with the Taliban, going behind the Afghan national government's back, the release of Taliban prisoners, unbeknownst to that. I mean, all of these happened not on your watch.
Yeah.
How do you reflect on that?
So if you go,
and on the Trump decision making, and what does that tell you about him and maybe what a Trump 2.0 administration will look like?
Well, it tells you that he's erratic and inconsistent for sure. And if you go back to the August 2017 speech President Trump gave when he made the decision that cut against his predilections, I think it's really the first time an American president has told the American people what they need to hear. What is at stake for us in Afghanistan or in South Asia broadly? It was a speech about the South Asia strategy. And what is a strategy that will deliver a favorable outcome at an acceptable cost and risk? And I think he did that. But then, of course, he had people in his ear. I'm sure after I left, there was a lot of reticence. Concern, I guess, that he would reverse it, and there was reticence on his part to make that decision. But he made it, and he actually wrote some of it, a few lines of that speech, and that medium sharp he always had. Part wrote it, part dictated it to me. That hey, this is not the decision I was going to make. But when you sit behind the desk in the Oval Office, it gives you a different perspective. And he talked about how he had come to understand the problem better and to challenge these assumptions, right? What did we hear over all these years about Afghanistan? We heard, there's a bold line between the Taliban and other terrorist organizations. Really? How's that working out? Or the Taliban is really kind of this romantic movement that just will come out of the mountains and be more benign this time and treat women better, for example. Or it's a transnational terrorist organization, that is funded by Gulf donors and trained and supported by Pakistan's inter-service intelligence. We heard these other tropes about, the graveyard of empires, or there's no military solution in Afghanistan. Well, the Taliban came up with one, didn't they? So what we did, as President Trump sent Ambassador Zal Khalilzad to negotiate, the administration began to partner with the Taliban against the Afghan government.
Unbeknownst to the Afghan government.
Well, yeah, but they weren't even allowed at the table. Yeah. Even President Obama, when President Obama left Iraq in 2010, he didn't negotiate with Al-Qaeda in Iraq when he left. So it made no sense. And then you had the withdrawal of our intelligence support, our air support. We gave them a timeline for our withdrawal, like the Obama administration had, and then tried to negotiate after we told them we're leaving on this date. How does that work? You know, and we forced them to release, as you mentioned, 5,000 of some of the most heinous people on earth. So it really was, if we were going to leave, why didn't we just leave? Why did we set up the Afghan government for failure, essentially?
Tomorrow night is the first presidential debate between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. We were lamenting in the green room that perhaps no foreign policy will be discussed, but I guarantee that if any foreign policy is discussed, it's going to be Afghanistan, because it is a hit the Republicans have against the Biden administration and the Harris-Biden administration.
And I think it's a valid criticism of the Biden administration too, believe me. Yes, absolutely. I mean, President Biden, he said, I had to adhere to President Trump's policies. I'm like, really? I mean, you didn't really adhere to any of the other ones.
Which strategy will Trump defend? Because you've just outlined two strategies that Trump had.
So what President Trump has been saying, and members of the administration, what they've been saying.
And which we listen for.
And there may be, who knows? This is kind of a counterfactual. They're like, hey, if we were in, we would have adhered to the conditions-based nature of the agreement, and we never would have completely withdrawn our forces because the Taliban weren't meeting the conditions. The other thing you'll hear, and this is a valid criticism, is that the evacuation and the withdrawal itself was a complete disaster, a humiliating disaster. I mean, it made no sense to give up Bagram Airfield, for example. I mean, how does it work that you evacuate your military before you evacuate civilians? Really? And then that whole perimeter of the Kabul airport was always going to be problematic. And I'll share this with you. I mean, I wrote a letter to President Biden in the spring of 2021. I asked him about his family. I said, hey, I wish you the best. I hope you succeed in your presidency. But I'm writing to you about Afghanistan. Not for you to reverse your decision to withdraw, but unless you do these 6 things, it's going to be an unmitigated disaster in Afghanistan. I mean, it was clear as day to me that this is how it was going to happen.
You sent this letter in April?
I sent it in April, yeah. And or it may have been May, I can't remember.
Did you hear back?
No, I didn't hear back. So about...
From anyone?
I heard that the president got it, and then I called a senior person in the administration about a week before we lost the 13 servicemen and women, and 170 Afghans were killed in the suicide bombing at Abbey Gate. And I had written an email actually, and I said, hey, and this was during the evacuation. I was working long hours with my research assistants. We formed the Hoover Afghanistan relief team at the Hoover Institution, and my fantastic students were working with Afghans to help them with their visa paperwork. We were trying to help coordinate, the evacuation part of it, but we were really also trying to locate, countries that would take them, get their visas processed, and get their travel authorizations. So my students were working on that. I was working on that, making calls to senior people in the military, people at Bagram, helping friends of mine, Afghan friends of mine, a former national security advisor, one of them, also a general who was their kind of Department of Defense spokesperson or Army spokesperson who would have been killed on site. Mm-hmm. And so that was happening. And in the middle of that, I sent kind of a little bit of an angry email to a senior person. And I just said, hey, I take the lack of a response on my letter to be the equivalent of F you, but I still want you to succeed, and there's a disaster that's about to happen. That person called me the next day, and I said, hey, you've got to open Bagram back up. We have a thing called an MLAD. It's basically an airfield seizure that our airborne forces and our Ranger Regiment is trained to do. I said, you got to commit the Ranger Regiment, reopen Bagram, create a humanitarian corridor between Kabul and Bagram. And he said, well, what about the Taliban? I said, well, tell them if they impede us in any way, we'll kill them, And he said, well, that'll take more troops. I said, yeah, but I mean, you're evacuating the soldiers, and there's still civilians there. I mean, how's that? So anyway, I was, you can tell.
And how did
I'm going to lay down for a minute.
We're going to make a right-hand turn and make it light in just 1 sec. But so ultimately, they said thank you for your suggestion, and
yeah, right. So here's what President Biden did, and this is from this has been reported and everything. President Biden is a very stubborn person, I think, overall. And if you read what he said during the Obama administration about the options for Afghanistan, he said that the American military was painting President Obama into a corner. What he meant was they were telling President Obama what President Obama didn't want to hear about it.
President Obama made a different choice.
He made a different choice. He made it really kind of a silly. He reinforced the security effort, but then he listened to President Biden at the end, and he announced the withdrawal timeline for those troops as soon as they arrived.
Is that the sort of the same thing that Trump had?
Thereby, sacrificing the entire psychological effect of the reinforcement. So, but that's
is that
another.
The same, a very similar mistake that Trump made? Trump basically had a good strategy and then
he abandoned it. Yeah, he abandoned it. And then we took a fundamentally different approach to even Pakistan. Remember President Trump tweeting, I think it was New Year's Day, 2018. He said, we're not going to give anything to the Pakistanis anymore. He said it a few times, right? And we did cut off our assistance. And then what President Trump did was reverse that again. Remember, he invited Imran Khan to come to the White House in the summer of, I think it was by 2018 still. I mean, or that soon. Remember, he was going to invite the Taliban to go to
Camp David
on September 11th, right? So, I mean, who knows who was in his ear? I don't know who was giving him that advice.
I have to ask this, just because what happens throughout the book is that you paint the picture of these successes that are based on people who are responsible, who are making good choices and giving him good options in front of him. And then these other decisions that he makes that have severe consequences. And it makes me think, as a voter, he's only going to be as good as the people around him, or as bad as the people around him. And as I think about what a next Trump administration is going to look like, I see that he's selected J.D. Vance, a sort of retrenchant neo-isolationist, to be his vice president. Now, maybe he won't listen to him for foreign policy. Yeah. Maybe he'll listen to Haggerty or people in.
Right.
But I don't know that as a voter.
Yeah.
So how does one assess what a second Trump administration is going to be like if you're only as good as the people around you?
Okay, well, and I'll make just 2 points. One is President Trump is consistent on a number of things, and some of these are very positive, right? Burden sharing from allies, okay, that's positive. I mean, don't go so far to say you're not going to defend them if they don't pay 2%, but I mean, but burden sharing
became the position after he wanted to withdraw from NATO.
No, it was all about burden sharing for me when I was there. Okay, and then, but he thought by threatening to withdraw from NATO, he could induce them to pay more. It was like a negotiating tactic thing, which then of course reduces the confidence within the alliance and creates opportunities for Putin. So I mean, I go through this, to some extent in the book, but also, reciprocity in trade is another. I think certainly he's going to be tough on China's weaponization of its economic model against us. He was kind of strung along by China in the hope of a big phase 2 trade deal, remember? And didn't maybe impose what he would have imposed in terms of.
He kind of folded at the meeting.
Well, he was strung along by the Chinese, which is what they do. But he'll have.
But that's not the art of the deal.
But okay, but now who comes in? No, but okay, so who comes in with him? On trade, Bob Lighthizer, who's fantastically competent, whether you agree with him or not, and he's a real tremendous public servant who understands his role. You mentioned others. Bill Haggerty's phenomenal. I think he would probably be in a position of influence and importance there. I'm thinking of kind of commerce or treasury.
Who would be his HR McMaster?
I don't know. I mean, Robert O'Brien could do it again, or it could be Ambassador Grinnell, who has a different agenda. I think. Kind
of in the.
Yeah. Well, I think he's a retrencher, basically. And I think that with President Trump, it's important to explain a couple of things. He's always asking these implicit questions. So what? Why do we care, right? What's in it for us, might be another way he would put it, right? The second thing would be, why do we have to do it? Why can't somebody else do it? How much does it cost? And can we drive down the cost? I mean, he's always thinking that way. So we would craft our briefings to answer those implicit questions, and so he wants to know. He doesn't believe in NATO as an article of faith like I grew up, believing in the Cold War. So you have to explain to him what's in it for us. You show him charts that shows, hey, this is what the military budgets of NATO are, and this is Russia's budget without us, and this is Russia's budget. So we are stronger with NATO. NATO does help us share the burden. Forward position capable forces are the most important deterrent, and it's a lot cheaper to prevent a war than to have to fight one, right? I mean, so you make these kind of arguments, and then, I mean, he kind of, he'll consider other options, or at least he did while I was there.
I worry that somebody like you won't be making those arguments in that circle, but that's for my editorialization, not for yours.
Well, you made a good distinction. There are confirmable positions, which I think they're going to be really solid people if he's reelected. It's the unconfirmed positions, which, who knows who's going to occupy those.
You write a lot about these confirmed positions also, the State Department and the Treasury Department and frankly, in fact, the Defense Department. You write about your challenges with the State Department and the Defense Department.
Maybe I was the problem. Do you think?
Well, here's what I mean. So now, as a student of when you read the book, if you haven't already, you will read that there was a lot of tension at the beginning of the administration with a Secretary of State who wanted to run all the policy for the State Department without talking to the president first, apparently, according to some tellings, and including many reports. A defense secretary who was working very closely with the Secretary of State, but not working with the president, not working with you.
Sure.
You studied the interagency process.
Yeah.
You're a historian of the interagency process. Having been through that as a national security advisor who was trying to create a process that would serve the president, having a Secretary of State and a defense secretary undermine that policy,
right,
and not really work with you, knowing everything you know now, what would you do differently?
Well, I don't know.
Like if you're going to start day one with the same people.
Yeah, maybe I would have like more, just candid conversation. I tried it. I actually in the book I write about my efforts to foster a more harmonious relationship, right, and greater collaboration and cooperation. Now we got it done. But as I write the book, everything was harder than it had to be. Everything was harder.
It's exhausting to read about.
I know.
Like I can imagine what it was like.
It was exhausting to resurrect a lot of those memories. I'll tell you. I mean, my wife was like, "When are you gonna be done with this book?" Oh my God, because I was getting grumpy and I was drinking more wine and getting grumpier, and so it was like a vicious cycle, So, but really the story is about trying to transcend. When I was in the job, I just tried to say, okay, I write about the serenity prayer in there, and I try to employ that, or really Stoic philosophy, right? Focus on what you can control, Aristotle, and you can get a lot done, So I think it worked. It was harder. It shouldn't have been that hard, and I got used up in the process, but I was at peace with that. I knew that the job was bigger than me. I knew my shelf life in the administration would be limited, and I wasn't going to make any compromises in terms of what I was doing for the president to keep my job longer, or to curry favor or something like that.
You just said you were getting used up. Great. We're going to go to questions in a sec. You're getting used up, and you weren't one of these people who's trying to stick around to hold on to power, right? You're just trying to serve the president, do the best you could, really serve the country. Yeah. But by getting, what I took away from the book was that you got used up by telling him things he didn't want to hear, or often you write, he would say, "I'm doing this for you, General." Yeah.
Right. Well, so what would happen is, okay, this is one of the dynamics is that President Trump would change his mind, but he would hate having to change his mind, and then he needed somebody to blame, and I was like right there all the time, So it was like one of the services I provided, while I was there. and then, I got used up as well because I wasn't of whatever the alt-right is, right, which has kind of a nativist agenda. It has an agenda of retrenchment, the end the endless wars mantra and so forth. And so they saw me. They labeled me the globalist general, and they tried to say, I was anti-Israel, I was weak on Iran, I was soft on terrorism. I mean, I've been hunting terrorists down like for years, So
soft on terrorism.
So I mean, it was kind of crazy. But they activated kind of the pseudo media, social media, and everything. So that was another avenue of attack. Then you had people within the administration who saw President Trump as a danger to be contained, and I was fighting to get him best analysis and multiple options, right? And that created a tension. There was people who didn't want to collaborate, and in my experience, President Trump was not capricious in terms of the use of force. Like, he wasn't dangerous in that connection. Mm-hmm. And so one of the stories I tell in the book is my effort to try to conduct contingency planning for Iranian aggression. Okay, we know what Iran's playbook is, right? I mean, it goes back to '79, right? They bomb our embassies. They attack our locations abroad. They attack Saudi oil fields. They can try to shut down shipping in the Gulf. They can. I mean, they do cyber attack. We know missiles, right? We know their playbook, right? We know what they do through proxies and everything else. So what I wanted to do was for us to do kind of some tabletop exercises, develop contingency plans for integrated courses of action ready to go for the president, right? That involved everything from financial and treasury actions to public diplomacy and information operations to military action and so forth, and intelligence operation. So that was just so hard to get done, because they wanted to meter or control the information that went to Trump. And they also wanted to try to get him like the single option. And that doesn't work with President Trump. Mm-hmm. It just wasn't effective. And with President Trump, it's reflexively contrary, right? If you go to him and say, everybody agrees, this is the perfect thing to do. I mean, he'll do the opposite just to spite everybody. So I would always argue to show him what he preferred as his option first. But as I mentioned, when he did change his mind, he would kind of blame me. And he would say oftentimes, I did that for you, General. I would say, Mr. President, don't do anything for me, You made the right decision, so.
There's an anecdote you tell in the book, which I had never heard before, but for those people who knew Donald Trump in New York for the 90s and 2000s and 2010s, it's a story that involves a tabloid headline and a Sharpie. Donald Trump would often, for celebrities or well-known people in New York, if they were written about in any connection to him or just on his own, sometimes just completely generously, he would cut out a headline with them that had their name in it, right. Take a Sharpie and write a note on it, like, great job, keep up the good work, and and just mail it to them. Like his assistant would put it in an envelope and just mail it to them.
Yeah.
So you walk into the Oval Office one day and you write in the book that you were constantly swimming upstream with Trump when it came to Russia and Putin. You talk about how he admired Putin, how you kind of couldn't ever quite figure it out. I have a quote for you about that. But you come into the Oval Office, you see him with a Sharpie. On a headline from the New York Post, it says, he's writing a note to Vladimir Putin. And the headline is, Putin heaps praise on Trump, pans U.S. politics. Okay? So he's denigrating the American...
Trump's great, America's
denigrating the American political system,
yeah, right, yeah.
But leaving praise on the guy. And so he's writing a Sharpie note to Putin, and he cuts it out, and he gives it to you, and he says, send this to Putin.
Right.
What do you do?
Okay, so this was late in the evening. I was staffing him for, I think, a phone call to the Far East. Maybe might have been to Japan. And so I was in the Oval Office on another matter when he gave this to me. It was exactly that day or around that time that the news was breaking about the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury, England, using a banned military-grade nerve agent called Novichok. And so I knew this was Russia behind it. We all knew. I mean, yeah, of course, who else is going to be. And I thought it would be embarrassing to the president if we sent this to Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin, of course, I wouldn't put it past him, he would publicize it, because Putin wanted to perpetuate the false narrative that there was, Trump collusion with Russia, or that Putin had something on him. I didn't see any evidence of that. And of course, if you read the Durham report and from the Mueller report that those were false accusations. But that cloud was always hanging over Trump, and Putin loves that. He loves that cloud was hanging over President Trump. And again, dividing us further and so forth. And so I brought it down to the staff secretary, who normally sends these things out to the embassy and then forward to the leader. And I said, don't send it, hang on to it. And then as the evidence mounted, I went back to President Trump, I think 2 days later, and I said, hey, that article you gave me, I didn't send it. And here's why I didn't send it, because I think he would embarrass you. Now we're about to give you options for responding to the Skripal murder attempt. Really, you could say it's a chemical attack on a NATO, ally. They placed hundreds, maybe thousands of people at risk when they did it. And so he got angry with me. I relate in the book, So it's one of those things that just kind of just get worn down over time. But I said, hey, I said to him, Mr. President, you have to know I did this for you. I did this with your interests at heart. And then he just kind of grumbled, and we went on. But each of these little incidents, with Putin, or I call it the 3 A's, that kind of were the millstones that ground down our relationship, and those were allies, and the importance of allies and his skepticism about them, authoritarians, and Afghanistan. Those were the 3. And when I left, he goes, General, he said, General, I agree with you 90% of the time. The other 10%, not so much, And that was in the 10. Those 3 were in the 10% category.
You did say, though, that after over a year on the job, you cannot understand Putin's hold on Trump.
Yeah.
How do you understand it now?
Well, I try to understand. Okay, so it was on a number of different levels. And I explained that President Trump's not the first U.S. president to think he can come to some kind of an entente with Putin. Remember George W. Bush when he met with Putin, and Putin
he looked into his eyes and
Putin let a little crucifix dangle from his shirt, and of course President Bush is going to ask him, right? And Putin tells this story. It's my grandmother's. Her house burnt down. It was the only thing left. And I've been warning it every day ever since. A total lie, right? Total lie. So remember, President Bush came out and said, I looked into his soul. I saw somebody who really cares about his people, right? Okay.
And John McCain said he looked into his eyes and saw 3 letters. KGB.
Yeah.
KGB.
KGB, right. Well, and then President Obama, remember, the same thing. I mean, this is after now the Georgia invasion. This is after, Ukraine.
But there's the reset strategy, which is Hillary Clinton.
Reset strategy.
Right. But these are all different. This feels different.
Well,
you describe this as
he labored under that same delusion that because he's the big deal maker, he could make a deal with Putin, and then Putin would play into that. Say, isn't it terrible, Donald? We're spending all this money on these destructive nuclear weapons. Aren't they terrible? What if we could just work something out? Or why he would play to his his deep skepticism about sustained commitments abroad, and say, why do you have troops in Syria, Afghanistan? You should just pull them back. And so he would play to President Trump. The flattery was part of it, but also it was his desire to actually have some really concrete objectives that he wanted to pursue, or he would say counterterrorism, or we could. This is the best from Putin. We can work together on cybersecurity. I mean,
so, but you say he really could never disentangle the Russia, the sort of charges and the discussion about Russia.
That's right. No, this is a big part of it. I should have said this too. Part of it was he had the cloud, right, of Russiagate over his head and the Mueller investigation. And that was unfair to him. I mean, honestly, it really was. I mean, it was terrible the way certain cable news stations were accusing him without any evidence. And so what happened is that created a sense of beleaguerment on his part, right? He already, he's a little thin-skinned. I don't know if anybody knows that. And so that would distract him if nothing else. And then also what he would do is conflate 3 questions. He would think them all, that they're all connected, but they're really different. The first is, did Russia meddle in our election and conduct a sustained campaign of cyber-enabled information warfare? Heck yes, they did. The second is, and this is relevant to the report that just came out last week, do they care who wins our elections? I really don't believe they care. And I believe the documents in the report that came out just a few days ago, I think that's a setup by Putin to make us think that they care.
But HR, or General.
I was just going to say what they want. Let me just say quickly.
Okay.
What Russia really wants is they want large numbers of Americans to doubt the legitimacy of the result of the election.
For sure they want that, but the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee report on Russian interference concluded that the Russian government disrupted an American election to help President Trump, or help Mr. Trump become the president, and that Russian intelligence services viewed members of the Trump campaign as easily manipulated, and some of Mr. Trump's advisors were eager to help from an American.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right, I'd take it there. I know what they say, but I came to.
You disagree with the Senate Bipartisan Intelligence Committee on Mark Warner and Angus King and Marco Rubio.
Yes, because I've seen probably the same materials that they've seen. I think that Russia is always running an operation against us, and they'll play both sides of every issue. So in 2016, for example, which is the area I'm most familiar with and saw the intelligence, 90% of the Russian traffic was on issues of race. The second, like a distant second, was on border, and the third was on gun control. So what they want to do is pull us apart from each other. For the election itself, what they really want is for us to doubt the legitimacy of the election. And politicians in both parties, Donald Trump took it to the next level with his election denial on January 6th, but politicians in both parties have played into this, by questioning the legitimacy of the elections. President Trump's doing it in rallies just yesterday. So we should stop doing their work for them, and I mean that's what both politicians on both sides have done. I mean,
I'm gonna
Yep.
I just did this documentary for PBS. Now I'm going to be so shameless.
Yep.
But if we want to play to your book, there's a PBS election integrity documentary that Firing Line just produced about the integrity of our elections and why you can have confidence in our elections. So I'm doing the anti-Russia counter work for them, and you all can watch on PBS or stream at any time.
That's really important work. I'm so glad you did that, Mark.
Sorry for the shameless plug.
No,
but
that's
it's
really rolling up.
Since you teed it up, listen, a lot of audience questions here. What should Donald Trump, what advice would you have for Donald Trump and Kamala Harris tomorrow night on foreign policy?
Okay, so I wrote an essay about this morning. It was out in the Free Press, and really I describe in it, President Trump's inconsistencies. So I would like to see him resolve some of the dissonance that he carries with him. Right, he has these opposing ideas in his head. He understands peace through strength, but he has this impulse toward retrenchment. Well, that's not strong. If you're withdrawing from certain parts of the world where we have allies and we're dealing with really, I think, a coalescing axis of aggressors. I would say that he should make a case for a greater degree of consistency in foreign policy and help resolve some of that dissonance. I have a long part in the book where I write about how in the drafting of the speech that he gave to the United Nations General Assembly in the summer of 2017, I tried to use that speech to help resolve, some of this dissonance. For the Harris, Vice President Harris, I think she has to break with some of the Biden strategies. I mean, explicitly, especially this tendency to conciliate Iran. I just don't understand it. I mean, this is what the Obama administration did for 8 years. It failed utterly. The Trump administration reversed that policy with success in terms of drying up the resources available for the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps and their proxy forces, the Soleimani killing and imposing costs directly on Iran and acknowledging what the return address is. The follow-on actions by the Trump administration, I think, conveyed less than a lower level of resolve. We can get into that. But then the Biden administration resurrected the approach to the Middle East that failed under the Obama administration. They brought back the same people to do it, and look, I think it contributed to October 7th. I think it contributed to the activation of the Ring of Fire around Israel. And what I would like to hear both candidates acknowledge is that the perception of weakness is provocative to this axis of aggressors. And that's a perception of weakness in terms of some of the fecklessness I would say, of the Biden administration's policy toward Iran and in the Middle East. But it's also that we're at each other's throats, and we have, our political discourse is so vitriolic and ad hominem. And, I would love to see them say we need to strengthen our nation and we have to portray strength because we're in a period of extreme danger, I believe. And I think the period of greatest danger we're going to face here is between the election and the inauguration. And I think this is when Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea may think, okay, now it's time for me to act. Because it's quite likely that election is going to be very close. And it's likely that either party may draw into question the legitimacy of the election. This is why your documentary is going to be so important. So that we have confidence in our election. So anyway, I just think I would like to see both of them say, we're in a dangerous period of time. It's a perception of weakness is provocative, and we need to act to reduce that perception in real ways by greater defense capabilities, but also just the way that we treat each other and the way that we speak with one another. The other issues are a break in the Middle East policy between Biden and Harris. I don't think that's not going to happen, sadly. I don't know why we treat our ally like they're the enemy and our enemy like we conciliate with the Iranians, and we don't know what the return address is. So I'd like to see that kind of a break, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Should candidates for president be required to get a security clearance prior to running for office or becoming president?
Yeah,
Could Trump pass the security clearance?
Well, yeah, because he's president, so he controls it. So yeah, I mean, you just automatically.
But he's not now.
You automatically get it. You automatically get it. Oh no, of course not. No, if he was like normal, like if he had not been the president, I mean, yeah, once you keep classified documents in your shower, President Biden probably couldn't either, because they were in a more secure location next to his Corvette, but still, it's not.
It seems though that the quality of the documents were different.
Well, I don't know. I've not. I shouldn't say whether I've seen any of the documents.
You were going to say that you've seen some of Trump's documents, and Okay.
Yeah.
Still has a security clearance. How about, we did the debate, should What do you think of a draft for national service with 3 options for placement: military, foreign service, national service, to bring the country together?
Yeah, I think national service is really important, but I wouldn't make it mandatory, because you want people who want to be in the Army, in the Foreign Service, in these critical jobs. I would incentivize it more. I would create more incentives for it, and I think that's
Pay for college?
possible to do. Yeah, pay for college like you do it with the Army, but I think it's ramp up some of these incentives. I think that a country that, it's a much smaller country and maybe could not be replicated here, but I'm really taken with the Norway example. In Norway, national service is mandatory, but they're selective within the candidates. So essentially, anybody can be drafted, but they only draft a certain percentage, and it's because of the quality that they go after. So if you don't get drafted in Norway, it's like a badge of dishonor, So the best people want to be in the Army, they want to be in the military. So I think there could be maybe different ways. And there was a great national committee on, Janine Davidson and others were on it years ago, on public service. I've got to look at that again, but it was very well done. And I think that's where they came down, is that there should be more incentives.
I'm for that. I'm for it. Do you think retired generals should be more or less involved in political leadership than they are today?
Yeah, I think political leadership is okay if they want to run for office. I think we need more, and I think that our members of Congress who have military experience tend to be those who are more bipartisan, and work together. There's a great organization called With Honor that Ry Barcott has founded. It's really a great organization. I'm an advisor to them, but they're a political action organization that will back candidates for office who have had government service or have served in the military mostly, but to back them, they have to take kind of a pledge to be bipartisan. They have to introduce a bipartisan bill during their first term. But what's really neat about it is he's created this community of people who get together. They have a house where they do social events, on the Hill. And I think he's part of the solution. So we need more of that, I think. Now, military officers, I think, should try to steer clear of partisan politics. There's a long tradition, obviously, of generals running for president and so forth. But what I'm talking about is kind of the mass endorsements of candidates. And right before we came in, Margaret was telling me that there's a new list that came out of people who are endorsed. I forget which candidate it was.
A letter came out today. This is the National Security Leaders for America,
right.
Whatever that is. But what it is it's a series of generals: 3 4-stars, 1 3-star, 2 3-star, 3 2-stars, of all the branches who came out and endorsed Kamala Harris. And the quote is, frankly stated, Donald Trump is a danger to our national security and our democracy. His own former national security advisors, defense secretaries, and chiefs of staff has said so. He continually disrespects those who serve in uniform, including wounded warriors, prisoners of war, and those who have made the ultimate sacrifice. He has disparaged fallen heroes as suckers and losers and insulted the heroic service of the late Senator John McCain. At his core, he does not understand selfless service and sacrifice, and he should never be allowed to serve as commander-in-chief in the greatest fighting force in the world.
Yeah.
Now,
well, here's
you didn't sign that letter. You're not going to sign that letter. You stay away from politics.
Yeah. Here's my concern with it. Let me just tell you what my concern is that, we are our nation's military. We're not the military of one political party or another. And I think while individual, retired general officers should obviously vote however they want, they can make whatever statements I think they want about candidates. But once you come up with a big list of generals or admirals, it can appear as if the military, even though they're retired, is endorsing one candidate or another. And I think if the military gets drug into this kind of partisan politics, it will be destructive to the institution. I think it's already kind of had an effect on recruiting based on really both political parties trying to drag the military into partisan politics. The military is not woke, the military is not extremist, but you hear these narratives that I think are affecting people's propensity to serve.
Well, you mentioned the Clinton administration before we came out.
Yeah, so this recent practice of big lists of flag officers, generals, and admirals, that really began under President Clinton when he was a candidate for president. he came out with this big list of people who endorsed him, and ever since then, every candidate has had there have been these dueling lists. I think it's just a bad practice. I mean, I think our founders were were right about keeping that bold line between politics and the military. They had in mind Oliver Cromwell, and also, I just think that that if the military allows itself to get drug in like that, which you can't, that'll really diminish the people's confidence in our military.
So if President Trump is reelected, what are you, one, excited about, or two, concerned about?
Okay, I would be excited about energy policy. I think that we have tremendous potential in our country to produce more energy in a way that meets multiple objectives. One would be to hurt adversaries who are using energy for coercive purposes. Another would be, especially with natural gas exports, to help get off of coal, for example, and reduce carbon emissions with the availability of cheaper natural gas. I think that we could also use that money to fund the green transition, and we might even be able, if we drive the price down, to tax it a bit here and pay down our debt. I think an approach like that around energy security, I'd be excited about that prospect. And I think the other one I would say was a significant buildup in the defense budget, which is what we need. We have a bow wave of deferred modernization. The force is too small. We have not fielded a lot of the critical capabilities.
Why are you confident President Trump will spend more money on the military?
I'm more confident.
I know Republicans want to. My version of
Well, I know
Republican
the Biden budget is, when adjusted for inflation, a reduction in defense spending.
But we're counting really on Republicans in the Senate and folks that are aligned with our.
And they're going to mark out the president's budget submission and probably increase more.
But what if we have a J.D. Vance in there and a Rick Grinnell in there?
So that's my big concern. My concern is the impulse toward retrenchment. And this kind of neo-isolationist sentiment. I think it's important for us to understand where that comes from, though. It comes from, I think, Americans who were left behind by the transition in the global economy in the 2000s, especially after China's entry into the World Trade Organization. Now think about what happened to many of these communities after the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Hey, toss in on top of that an opioid epidemic. Then throw on top of that, the maladies associated with social media that shows people, more and more extreme content to get more and more clicks and more advertising dollars. I think this is how we have really worn down kind of our common identity as Americans. Many Americans are very frustrated. They believe that Washington elites have abandoned them, and I think this is what gives rise, to President Trump's appeal. This is what J.D. Vance taps into, and other retrenchers. And so I think it's a real sentiment. It has real roots that we have to try to understand. Anybody ever read George Packer's book, The Unwinding? I mean, it was before President Trump, but you can see President Trump coming in every page of that book, really. So I think we have to try to understand it. So that's my big concern about Trump. For the Biden administration, I would say I would be excited for the continuation of the approach toward China.
Harris administration.
Harris administration, I'm sorry.
I know, the switch.
If there's continuity between Biden, assuming that there's continuity between Biden and Harris, I would be excited for Gina Raimondo to have a very prominent role on the approach to China. She's fantastic, I think, as a Secretary of Commerce, who has a great background as a governor. She was an entrepreneur. She knows the business world, and she played rugby, which is even cooler.
She's so little. That's amazing. I didn't know that. I just learned something new about Secretary Raimondo.
So I think the approach toward China would be a big one, and then I think the disaster would continue in the Middle East. I think the lack of support for Israel, I can't imagine. I saw Vice President Walz's statement yesterday. I almost didn't believe it, because it was all about Israel and nothing about, what Hezbollah was doing in the north, or, what Iranian, terrorists and militias are doing in the West Bank, or the fact that, that Hamas needs to be completely destroyed. I mean, here's what I really can't fathom in the Biden. I don't understand it. They'll talk about the need for a ceasefire. Well, if there's a ceasefire before Hamas is destroyed, then what happens is Hamas still has the guns. And if you want any kind of progress toward an enduring peace, or maybe someday a two-state solution, you can't have an organization in power that wants to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. That doesn't sound like they're signing up for a two-state solution to me, you know? So I think you have to regard the destruction of Hamas as a precondition for getting back on a path to some sort of a, you know, an enduring peace. And then also, again, as I mentioned, we have to start acting like we know what the return address is. I do believe that, you know, that Iran is prepared to expend every Arab and Palestinian life to accomplish its two objectives of driving us out of the region and destroying Israel. And until we impose costs on Iran, until we wake up to the fact that this is actually a country that's pretty weak, but is racing to get the most destructive weapons on earth, which I think is going to activate the Begin Doctrine for Israel. And I think we're going to have, I think we're in for at least another decade of pretty intense warfare in the Middle East. The only way I think we could maybe, you know, resolve this faster is if we begin to act like we know what the return address is and who's behind it, which is the Iranians.
Iran. Last question. There's a question here about John McCain and his denigration of President Trump's denigration of soldiers, Medal of Honor recipients, and prisoners of war like John McCain. You end your book with John McCain. In your, you know, after you, as you talked to all of the national security staff, you received this standing ovation as you walked out. You came back to your office and your assistant or one of your colleagues says, you have one more call. He wanted to be the last one that you received while you were in office. And then you said General McMaster at Senator McCain. McCain is quoted to say in your book, "I want you to know that I am proud of you, admire you, and consider it a privilege to have served with you." To which he responded, "Senator, the privilege has been mine. I cannot thank you enough for your example, mentorship, and friendship over the years. It is me who admires you." Why was it important for you to recall that story at the end of your book?
Well, because Senator McCain, I think, epitomized the sense of service, you know, and one of the themes in the book, and selfless service. He was an extraordinarily selfless person, you know, from his experience as a POW, the kind of the, you know, the resilience he demonstrated there, and the constant concern for his fellow prisoners. And then it was never about him, you know. I mean, I got to know him very well over the years when he would visit Iraq and Afghanistan. I spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan after 2003 mainly. And it was a time when our strategies were a mismatch with the situation on the ground. And I would have very candid conversations about him, about, you know, the disconnect. And then he did something about it, you know, and he tried to forge bipartisan support for big shifts in those policies or to get the resources necessary, you know, and so he was a big source of support for me over the years. You know, as badly as he was treated by President Trump, he never tried to draw me out into criticism from him or anything like that. Anyway, it was really very moving to me that he wanted to be the last call, you know. And one of the themes in the book is the rewards of service. And I hope what came through, Margaret, is a sense of gratitude for the opportunities to serve, including as National Security Advisor. It's a fantastic job. It's a privilege. And I hope that if young people read the book, and I hope that they do, that they will understand better the tremendous rewards of service and decide to serve their country in various capacities.
General McMaster, thank you for your service.
Thanks,
and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, buddy.